You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
This is the CRM Archaeology Podcast. It's the show where we pull back the veil of cultural resources management archaeology and discuss the issues that everyone is concerned about. Welcome to the podcast. Hello and welcome to the CRM Archaeology Podcast, episode number 140 for July 4th, 2018. Happy Independence Day. I'm your host, Chris Webster. On today's show, we talk about CRM and whether it's really historic preservation. So get ready to do some heavy thinking because the CRM Archaeology Podcast starts right now. Welcome to the show, everyone. Joining me today is Bill in Boise this time.
Good morning.
Doug in Scotland.
Hey, everyone.
Sonia in Utah.
Hello.
And Steven in Calgary.
Hi.
So I'm getting over a little bit of a cold, so I'm going to minimize what I say on this show. And because of that, we have a fortunate circumstance that Bill came up with a nice topic a little while ago, and I think we're going to talk about it today. And I'd like to acknowledge that this is the first time I'll have to look back in our archives. I mean, I don't remember the last time all five of us were on the show. Everybody probably remembers or maybe doesn't, but the original reason I had this many people was so we could at least have, maybe three on any one recording, because everybody has work schedules and things like that, especially over the summer, never expecting all five. And we used to have something like seven just for that backup, but this is great, right? Summertime, June. As we're recording this, it's the middle of June. I know it's coming out in the early July, but as we're recording this, it's the middle of June. And, it's great to have all five people on here. So, and it's kind of weird because it feels like wintertime or something. We never get all five unless it's winter, and it's raining and cold here in Reno, which is also weird. So anyway, Bill, why don't you go ahead and introduce the topic and what you were thinking about when you broached it to us.
So there's a lot of reasons why I would think about this, but the topic is basically a questioning of how we all feel when we finish doing CRM and then we see what happens to the site that we worked at. And there's a couple of reasons why I thought of this. As Chris just said, I'm here in Boise right now, and the site that I did for my dissertation a few years ago that led to creating a historic property here and preserving a house, I just went by and I saw that they're doing landscaping, and they've pretty much annihilated all, if not a substantial portion, so much that I had to look away of the archaeology. So, the archaeology contributed to the campaign to save this place. You can look it up. It's the Irma Hayman House, and it's the second African-American historic property in the state of Idaho. And they wanted to save it, but the archaeology contributed greatly to the campaign and made the place known to the people who live in the area. So, I mean, it was pretty interesting to see that and in the planning meetings, it was just understood, yeah, there's archaeology there. We'll minimize our impact. Yeah, we're just going to do a couple of little bit of excavations here and there. And then I went by and, unbeknownst to me or any of the other archaeologists that were working on this, the whole back area seems to be blown out, right? So, first of all, that wasn't necessarily a CRM project. It's owned by the city. They can do whatever they want with it. And, the project that they were doing was not funded by, federal law. There was no federal nexus. They had actually already done archaeology, and I designed it as if it was a data recovery. So if there was data, we did sample and have a good idea of what's there. It's just interesting to see that they, wanted to save the house, and they've done a great job of doing that. But the archaeology component wasn't really a serious consideration in the end. And then it got me thinking about some of the stuff that I teach in my class at Berkeley, the CRM class or the heritage conservation class, about learning the laws of historic preservation and the origins of those things coming in the wake of, urban renewal and a whole bunch of other things that kind of finally culminates in the late 60s to where we have an NHPA. And the whole goal was that communities could finally take control and save the resources that mattered to their own heritage. And so there was a whole process, and everything was very clearly defined. But right now, it seems like CRM has become kind of the main, focal point or mechanism for historic preservation in the United States, and we work under these laws. And the idea is that archaeology is supposed to be identifying sites, and those that are really substantial and significant are going to be preserved for the future, and that we're going to do our best. But the actual reality, especially if you've worked in CRM for a long time, it seems like the reality is we do the archaeology, and then that mitigation, in quotation marks, is all of the historic preservation that place ever receives, and significant sites get blown away. And so if you want to stay in CRM, you're going to have to figure out some kind of a way to reconcile that in your own mind, a way of working that through logically. But what I want to talk about today is, how do we all feel about that?
Well, Bill, let's start by defining preservation. Like, how do you personally define preservation when in regards to an archaeology site? Like, what are the different types of preservation that you think of when you think of preservation? I know what my answer is, but I'm curious what yours is.
Well, like I said, I guess we could split hairs, but really, historic preservation, what a lot of people think is building preservation. So, in historic preservation, when it comes to buildings and that kind of stuff, there's preservation, restoration, recreation, and conservation. And so those are all four different you know technical definitions that we've all created for when we're treating a building. Now, archaeological sites, there's not really recreation of an archaeological site, right? So there's conservation, yeah, and then there's preservation, minimizing the amount of change that happens. But we can't really treat archaeological sites the same way we would buildings or structures, right? So I guess that's the question is really, how does each community interpret that for their own selves? Because the way it's set up, the practitioners in that area and the people who are administering those properties are really the ones who are kind of making the decisions on that property. And so, in some places they preserve sites. In other places, I mean, Doug might be able to tell me a bit more, but in Europe, I don't really think that it's possible for you to preserve every single site, because there's sites on sites on sites, thousands of years of um, history and archaeology all in one spot. And so it's really up to that community to decide, how much destruction is enough, or where we draw the line, or anything like that.
I think that some of this, like as far as archaeology goes, preservation is usually kind of like leave it in place. Maybe stabilize the surrounding their surrounding soils if it's starting to erode out or something like that. That as one of the mitigating measures that we can do to mitigate impact is Tom King, I think, calls it like flag and avoid. But one of the problems with this, and one of the reasons that Tom King has talked against it, is that there's no follow-up, right? Like, we can be like, okay, we're going to flag this off and we're going to avoid it. But then another project comes down the pipe that doesn't trigger review, 5-10 years later, 2 years later, whatever. And there's not necessarily anybody minding the store. Like, like who's, if we're trying to preserve it, who's watching it? So flag and avoid doesn't really work unless you have like some sort of managerial oversight, which, a lot of municipalities have. A lot of municipalities have some sort of archaeological management plan, and someone who reviews particularly city projects that come through the pipe to ascertain whether are these areas theoretically protected? Are they not? That sort of thing.
That's interesting, because we do that a lot out here in Nevada, because there's so much land. So 9 times out of 10, when we find something that we determine either unevaluated, which I think a lot of people I don't feel like do that anymore. Like, if you're out there, you're evaluating the site one way or the other. I end up looking at a lot of sites that were from the 80s or even the 70s that were just left unevaluated. It's just like they saw something, they're like, I don't know, maybe. So they just said unevaluated. And
sometimes that's just a matter of like,
yeah,
further study needs to get done, and
sure,
that's not part of our scope. So
Right.
someone needs to come back and look at it, or you can just redesign your project and avoid it altogether, which, particularly if it's, federal land or something like a large landmass, that's pretty easy to do.
Yeah, and one of the other problems though with the flag and avoid thing is, especially with prehistoric sites, is erosion. We're affecting the landscape, in dramatic ways. We're affecting the climate in dramatic ways. So some of these sites that have been sitting on the surface for thousands of years, with virtually little to no issue with them sitting on the surface for thousands of years, in the course of the last 30 years since they were first recorded. And now, in Nevada, just to clarify for people that don't know, if the site was recorded over 10 years ago, it's a full re-record if you encounter it again in the field. If usually we're looking for previously recorded sites when we're in a project area, we'll do a research and, record search and find that out first. And then if it's older than 10 years, recorded more than 10 years ago, then we do a full re-record of it. Well, I mean, a lot of times when we find these sites that were maybe potentially eligible or something like that, and now because of erosion, because there is a mine there somewhere, there is somebody working near there, and maybe there was BLM vegetation thinning, maybe something happened, I don't know, but we've affected the landscape, and now the site's no longer eligible because it's either we can't find enough of the material, or whatever was found to trigger potentially eligible or something like that to begin with is just simply no longer there. Or in some cases, artifacts were collected off of sites. I've seen sites that were recorded 3 or 4 times in the past 30 or 40 years, and each time somebody collected something else, and then as you came down the line, the site became less and less eligible because they took everything off of it. So it's like, what the hell, its evaluation changes because of archaeological practices, not because of the site's importance itself. It's interesting the way that works sometimes. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I think going back to the 80s, there had been a practice of, like oversampling as a mitigation method.
Mm-hmm.
Like, well, we don't actually want to go to, like, come back and excavate the site, so they'll just collect everything until there's no site there. And that predates my career, but I remember hearing about it, and it was very strongly argued against by various shippos. That this is not good practice. But yeah. Well, but in your case, because it's like a land, it's managed land, right? Like there's theoretical some level of governmental oversight. That a lot of places will actually do site monitoring. Not necessarily visiting every site every year, but doing the rounds and just making sure, like, every couple of years, is this site still here? Is it eroding out? Are there potential impacts? Has somebody been tearing it up with their trucks, or what are the managerial issues? I think that the real problem is when you start trying to apply these concepts in private land, like that. There's nothing for that, right? There's no governmental oversight for monitoring the condition of the site, or even making sure that a flag and avoid works.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, unless you have a monitor on site, flagging and avoiding doesn't always happen. Like, it shows up in the plans, but what's going on in the ground, because a lot of people working on projects further down the road aren't necessarily looking at the original plans, right?
Right.
Yeah, but the other aspect to this too is the fact that we're identifying sites and we're saying they're significant enough to play, add information in American history, but then recommending that we just dig some of it up, and that's the preservation. So, they're significant enough that they require some kind of archaeology, but they're not significant enough for us to flag and avoid, or to keep, or to protect, or for this to stop the project in any way. I mean, it's extremely rare in the situation of a lot of infrastructure construction. I mean, if they're past the planning stage and they're going to widen the highway, and you find a 9,000-year-old archaic site, they're probably going to figure out some kind of a way to do archaeology on it and treat that as the preservation rather than redesign. If they've made it to that stage in the process, there's kind of not going to be anything that's going to stop them from just destroying the site, right? So,
but that's not presented as preservation, right? That's mitigation, which is not the same thing. Mitigation is not always preservation, and to carry that forward to, I'm sure you've all seen the digital scanning that Google's been pushing, and it's like that's not preservation, but digital recording, scanning, and 3D modeling and stuff like that, that can be a form of mitigation. You're not preserving anything, but like sometimes things are at that level where it's not like we can't ever touch it. It's that for archaeological sites, we go in and we get the data that made it important, and now we have that data.
Yeah, I hear that. So then and I understand exactly what you're saying, Stephen. I guess how many of us feel like we are actually contributing to preservation then instead of just doing mitigation? Because I know there's a and I had it for many years. There's a deep-seated ethos that we are the ones who are preserving these things, because without us, they'd be destroyed entirely and no one would know anything about it. And so as years go by, you start to realize, no, actually, we're just mitigating the damage that we're already causing to the world, right?
Well, but I think a lot of the perspective is that we are, we're getting more archaeological data. That's the kind of the CRM perspective, right? It's like it's not a matter of preservation. That a lot of archaeologists really want to go dig up sites, and they want to get that data, and they want to write it up, and down the line through synthesis and coming up with better narratives of what has happened here. Whereas preservation would be like just avoiding it altogether.
I don't necessarily agree with that. Part of mitigating an archaeological site, if you separate the word mitigation from it, is actually gathering the data that would have been lost. That in and of itself is part of preservation. So you are preserving the material culture in some context, which is actually part of cultural resource management and historic preservation, historic context. I mean, if you look at the strict definitions of things.
That's not preservation.
In what way?
It's not preservation. Like the site is gone, like Bill was saying.
So preserving the material culture and the potential definition or interpretation of what was going on at that site is not considered any form of preservation to you?
No.
The data is not completely lost. The
data
is there.
Not lost, but the property itself is gone.
Okay, then that's the separation, the difference between historic preservation and cultural resource management.
Yes, preservation is an aspect of resource management, but not all of resource management is preservation.
Exactly.
You are managing, you are managing the resource, right?
Exactly. You're managing portions or all of the resource.
I guess the biggest thing when it comes to talking about archaeological sites, as we do about historic properties, is those 4 approaches to treatments of historic properties that I was talking about. So, when it comes to a building, you have the option to rehabilitate something or restore it or reconstruct it, but you really can't do those kind of things with an archaeological site, because once we dig it, it's gone. So the formal, way, the mechanistic way that historic preservation works in the United States, you can't really apply most of that stuff to archaeological sites.
That's because historic preservation frequently applies to the built environment. Mm-hmm. That's part of its definition.
Yeah, but archaeological sites are part of it.
That's a good place to stop, because Sonia's been itching to give us a preservation definition, and we will do that on the other side of the break, and we'll continue this conversation there. This network is listener supported. We're trying to move away from paid advertising while also creating new shows and supporting the ones we have. The APN has never and will never make a serious profit on our podcast. Every little dime we make goes back into the network and improving show quality. So become a member today at www.archpodnet.com/members to show your support, get some extras, and be a benefactor for archaeological education. Members get stickers, a coffee mug, a t-shirt, bonus content, early access to episodes, a private Slack team to talk to other members and the hosts, and full access to training on Team Black over at arccert.black.
So check out our memberships at www.arcpodnet.com/members today and support archaeological education. That's www.arcpodnet.com/members.
The Archaeology Podcast Network has partnered with TeePublic to bring you some awesome gear that looks good, promotes archaeology, and puts a few pennies in our pockets so you can get free podcasts. Check out our designs at arcpodnet.com/shop. That's arcpodnet.com/shop.
All right, we are back with episode 140 of the CRM Archaeology Podcast, and we are talking about CRM as historic preservation. And we were just getting into it in the end there on kind of we were talking about our sort of interpretations of preservation and how CRM works and things like that. So Sonia, you pulled up some actual definitions of preservation, so we can maybe use that to frame some of the rest of our conversation. How is preservation defined?
In general, and remember the Secretary of the Interior standards, they don't seem to have an actual definition. They have comprehensive historic preservation planning and historic contexts and what historic properties are. They don't actually have a formal definition of that, but what I have been able to pull out is the general idea of what historic preservation in the U.S. is. So in essence, it's an endeavor to seek or to preserve, conserve, and protect buildings, objects, landscapes, and other artifacts of historic significance. It specifically refers to the preservation of the built environment and not to like forestry, wilderness areas, and other like recreational areas and things like that, unless there is part of there is a built environment as part of that. And most of us like to think that we know what the definition of cultural resource management is. It's a vocation, and it's a practice of managing cultural resources, including its arts and heritage. So it's usually concerned with traditional and historic culture, not necessarily strictly buildings or the built environment. So cultural resource management is part of historic preservation, but not all of that. So CRM is primarily focused on the material culture of archaeology, and not necessarily all of the preservation portion that goes into it, although that is a component of it. So when you start talking about the Secretary of the Interior standards and goals with regard to historic preservation, their goals are primarily establishing general standards for archaeology and historic preservation, and those standards are focused on historic preservation planning and context. And the way to, as we were kind of getting at earlier, is to establish context is to not only look at historic records, but also to withdraw the material culture from the ground or from the structure itself.
All right. So, in the last segment, we were talking about preservation. Bill brought this up, and because of a historic site that he obviously worked on and is, back and taking a look at now and noticing some changes, of course. But I think the difference, when you talk preservation, we really have to talk about the difference between like historic preservation and prehistoric preservation too, and maybe make that definition clear, because I do think that there's two primary ways that you can preserve, well, maybe three primary ways you can preserve a prehistoric site. One of those ways can be to dig it up, because if that's going to save it, then you preserve the data. If that's one way you want to kind of look at that, you preserve the data by recording the data and then taking it that way. Because if you hadn't dug it up, we don't have subsurface techniques good enough to actually even tell what's under the ground, down to the fine level. Obviously, GPR can find some things and some other methods can find other things, but the actual detail, we still need to excavate to find out what's actually under the ground. So what are we preserving if we don't actually dig it up? We don't actually know. We're preserving based on what we see on the surface or on random sampling or whatever other sampling strategy we used. So that's one type of thing. Another type of preservation that I know is done a lot in the Southeast, where I worked, first part of my CRM career, is to just actually build a building over the top of it. It sounds kind of weird, and I don't think it actually works, because if you've got a deeply buried site, things get buried pretty quickly over there because of hurricanes and things like that, especially on the coastal plain. If you've got a deeply buried site and you put a slab over the top of it and then a building over the top of that, nobody's ever going to get to that site. But the chances of anybody knowing once that building is destroyed and the slab is destroyed and something else is put there, the chances of anybody knowing there was actually a site under there, it's like, kind of, what's the point? You know what I mean? And then the other way is to just avoid it, and move on, the flag and avoid things. So that's prehistoric preservation. Historic preservation is completely different, obviously. I mean, we could go through and kind of argue that if I take a 3D scan, detailed 3D scan of an entire building before they knock it the hell down, maybe that's the digital preservation I can do on it or something like that. But that's not preserving it for the community and for the enjoyment of others to come, unless we live in a virtual reality world. So, who knows? Anyway, I just had to get those thoughts out there. Doug, I think you had some thoughts.
Yeah, I have two comments. One is I agree with Chris on the aspect of, I don't think when we build something over a site and say it's preserved, that's actually preservation.
Yeah.
Mainly because we actually have no idea what's happening to that site, and I would prefer to actually see someone go back and look at these sites and see what's happening. I mean, you are dropping tons upon tons of material on top of a site. You're possibly pumping out groundwater or changing, all sorts of stuff. That's going to have some sort of impact on the site. And we actually have no idea what that impact is. We just kind of assume that, we've put a building over it, it'll be safe. It'll still be stuck in the ground. And I could think of a million ways that having a building there would easily cause damage to a site, from compression to, if you put a building there, maybe it has a basement, maybe the water table's a bit high, so you have to start pumping it out. Well, then you're going to dry out the site, destroy whatever organics is there. I mean, there's quite a few different ways. So I am agreeing 100% with Chris on, a building on top of something is not preservation. But this being me, I might also disagree with Chris.
There it is.
Yeah. couldn't leave it alone. We have to keep our tradition going there, Chris.
That's right.
And I really hate. So what you're describing is, I've heard what they usually call in the UK preservation by recording, and that's not preservation. That's not the definition. And I know we can go back and forth on definitions and stuff like that, but if you're quote unquote preserving by recording, you're actually destroying everything and taking a little bit of information and calling that preservation, but it's not. Preservation is keeping everything exactly the same. So maybe it's not so much disagreement with Chris as it's a bugbear of mine when everyone's like, preservation by recording. That's not preservation. That's maybe mitigation. That's doing archaeology, but that is in no way preservation. That's just my 2 cents.
I guess maybe the issue at the heart of this thing is selective preservation, which I don't even know if there's a term for that, but it's definitely part of the whole selecting what narrative you want, and part of the entire placemaking process and the whole process of creating a narrative that you need in order to get it past the advisory council, or I guess the National Park Service administers the National Register, right? But at any rate, you have to create a justifiable argument for preserving this place, and in this case, they've decided to focus on the house and the architectural component of this multi-component site. So we're talking about prehistoric, historic. There's plenty of sites in Arizona that have pueblos, ruins, mounds, and all kinds of stuff that are either architectural remains or architectural ruins that get a different kind of treatment. If we were to preserve a place, an archaeological site, they'll get a different form of treatment for the architectural remains. Sometimes that's just conservation, or sometimes it's conservation as if they're going to fix the adobe or whatnot, to the way it was in the period of significance. Other times it's just to allow it to decay and just manage the site by avoiding it, not letting people dig in it. And there's going to be ground squirrels and the adobe is going to melt and everything, but they're just keeping that place safe. In other cases, we do excavation, right? And so when it comes to that, they're going to excavate probably the archaeological component, the inside and the outside of the Pueblo walls or the adobe walls or something like that. But they're probably going to leave the actual architectural component there with very little analysis on the architectural component. So it's all of us CRMers in every way are choosing and selecting what pieces of this historic site we want to preserve and in what way we want to do that. And I guess that is maybe at the heart of the NHPA, that communities and administering agencies are the ones who make those decisions, and they make those decisions hopefully for the community. I mean, we can imagine that the community is getting input, but really it's kind of CRMers deciding what's the most significant aspect of this site we've decided is significant, and then trying to preserve pieces of that.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think that's why we have, or you have, I'm in Canada now, the four criteria, right? It's like they address different aspects of potentially the same property. And what's more important? Is the ability to provide data more important than its association with an important person or event? As far as communities go, when you start getting into like a more heritage focused aspect, that maybe the data that archaeology can provide is only of a limited use, and maybe it's oftentimes archaeology is of primary interest to archaeologists, not necessarily the greater communities. I kind of want to go back though on a couple of points. First, we briefly touched on the capping thing, and I don't necessarily agree with like slapping a whole building on top of it, but it's like capping's actually in my mind, capping is actually a reasonable mitigating technique, but it has like really narrow window of opportunities. Like there have been a number of studies involving intentionally burying sites and putting roads on them and driving on them and doing various things with varying degrees of success. And most of these studies were done in the 70s and 80s, and I think maybe a few that I'm familiar with that were done in the 90s. And they they capped them, left them capped for like 10 years or 15 years, and then went back and excavated them. And actually, there's a great one out of California where they actually had to like side excavate because there was a highway still on top of it. They didn't tear up the highway, and to judge like what are the effects of these capping techniques on sites. And in some cases they work well, in some cases they didn't work at all. And it really kind of comes down to like when you design this, because this is a designed mitigation, that you really need a lot of engineers involved who have better understanding of like the engineering effects than like your average archaeologist, and come up with ways to deal with these potential issues. But then in the long term, again, it's essentially kind of a flag in the void, because the site's still there, and you have to have some level of management plan of how these things will be dealt with further down the line. Because if it's private land and or nobody's watching this, watching it, eventually, people will be like, well, hey, we built a building there. There must be nothing there. And you really need to be able to, keep that in mind.
I want to address that real quick, Stephen, because that's such a good point. Because I agree with you too. I think that in some cases, capping can actually be good, but not in all cases. I think Doug hit it on the head when he said like compression and things like that. Especially you look at it in the Southeast, where I said that I first encountered that as commonplace. When I say they put a building on top of it, I mean like a several 100,000 ton Walmart slab, on top of several sites, which who knows, like with runoff and things like that, and the compression over time, is that actually doing damage to projectile points? Probably not. To pottery, probably, but who knows? So is that preservation? But like you said, it really goes down to it's not as common of a practice for us to just sit and think about that. When I go to do an evaluation, especially for like a cell tower or something like that, and I see this huge, relatively modern built environment, and I'm like, okay, there's nothing here. That's my first thought, because I see buildings. I assume if those buildings aren't historic, that there's nothing there. It's not right on the top of my head to think, oh, maybe there's sites preserved under these slabs for these buildings. That's just not something that we commonly think about. So it would have to be like Sonia is mentioning in the chat here, that she's successfully advocated for capping 1 or 2 sites under some highways, or at least in one case. And like you mentioned, Steve, in that other one. And that's probably almost, I don't want to say worse, but you really have to be on top of it, because a highway is generally built, unless, it's like a bypass or something like that. But often highways are built up from smaller and smaller roads through time, right? I mean, a lot of the main highways we have were built because that's where the thoroughfares were, back in the day. So there's a good chance that if somebody caps a site with a highway, that it's going to be there for hundreds and hundreds of years until we have flying cars and we don't need highways anymore. And then, then who knows, but when all that time goes by and they rip up the highway, is anybody even going to remember there was a site under there? So is that preservation, and I don't know. It's a good question.
And that would have to be part of the management plan, right? It's like, how do you deal with the deaccessioning of existing highways?
Right.
I would like to just looked at the time. Maybe this will be a good point for the next.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's take a break, our final break, and then when we come back on the other side of this, we'll wrap up this discussion on, is CRM actually historic preservation? It's a good topic. Back in a second.
Hey, podcast fans and digital archaeologists. Have you heard about WildNote? It's a data collection app that works online or offline on your smartphone or tablet, iOS or Android. It allows you to collect field data easily, manage data efficiently, and generate data reports and site records effortlessly. We have a growing list of state site forms built in for your use, and some generic forms that will work anywhere. Check out the shovel testing and photograph forms. You can get a free all-access 30-day trial today by going to wildnoteapp.com. That's wildnoteapp.com for your free 30-day trial. Tired of the webinars and training offered by the big organizations not being free for members and not really covering what we need? Team Black has the answers. Check out arccert.black/main for our upcoming webinar schedule. All of our webinars happen once a month and seating is limited. Learn everything from field tech basics to drones to digital workflows. We have more classes coming online every month. Classes are always 1 hour. Classes like building a CV and getting a job are always free. That's right. We'll help you get a job, then we'll be here when you want to level up your skills. If you are a professional subscriber to the APN at arcpodnet.com/members, then you get all of Team Black's offerings for free as part of your membership. We have Team Black memberships coming that will give the same for the APN. So $20 a month gets you all the APN swag and extras, plus free training from Team Black. So check out arccert.black for more information and level up your skill set today. That's arccert.black. Now back to the show.
All right, welcome back to the CRM Arc Podcast, episode 140, and we were finishing up our discussion on CRM as historic preservation. And right before we ended the last segment, Stephen, you were about to launch into a brilliant discussion, I'm sure. Go ahead.
Or, tirade, whatever.
Tirade, whatever.
Yeah, well, and because I kind of felt the need to clarify when I interrupted Sonia in the first segment about, but that's not preservation. And we've been kind of dancing around that a little bit, and debating the notions of preserving data, and preserving artifacts, and versus preserving sites, and I think part of the reason I'm big on that's not preservation, comes from a couple of different places. The first is that for CRM, particularly the National Historic Preservation Act, is we are looking at, the historic properties are places. Like we're evaluating them against the National Register of Historic Places criteria. We're talking about places, not artifacts, not not data, but the places themselves. And by that criteria, when thinking about it in those terms, we're not, like excavating up a site does not preserve that site. I mean, yeah, we have to excavate a little bit maybe to, ascertain whether the site's important or not. But really what it comes down to is that place itself. And then the other reason is when you have to deal with historic buildings, say, like they have very narrow window of what counts as preservation and what is actually reconstruction. Or, so if I were to replace portions of a building, that's not preservation. If I'm going to, reconstruct the older look and feel of a building, but it requires that I remove, like original material, that's not preservation. Reconstruction is a way to manage these historic resources, these cultural resources, but it's not considered preservation. Preservation comes first, and then, down the line, like reconstructions, next, and further down the line. And for us, that kind of works the same way. That, preservation is in place, and yeah, we don't necessarily know what's there exactly, right? Because we haven't gone in to recover that data. But it's preservation is theoretically the first thing in line. The SAA code of ethical conduct,
something like that, ethical principles.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. But like one of the codes is, particularly in the 90s when I was, a student coming up, it was all about like preserving the past for the future, and don't excavate the entirety of a site unless you have to. That, first and foremost comes that preservation, leaving some of that site there. And whether that means it's going to degrade naturally, and we try to prevent erosion and, compression and, looters, and unnecessary excavation. But then if that's not a viable option, we move down the line. What comes next? Well, we can excavate that site and get, useful data, hopefully useful data, data we presume will be useful. Maybe we only have the budget to, excavate a sample of it. So this is the next step down the line. And that's kind of how it works, right? Is that as part of the resource managing, we have to approach it as, like we can't always do the best thing, but we try to do, good, I guess.
Yeah, so that brings me to the reason why we're even having this conversation, because sometimes there's an emotional effect that happens when you work on a site. We've all worked on a lot of sites before, and sometimes it doesn't seem like there's any attachment at all to these sites. They're supposedly National Register eligible, so they met the criteria. That's the reason why we actually dug them, because they met the criteria of what the United States would want to preserve, right? But then we dig on them and do the work and everything, and we don't necessarily feel any kind of an attachment, right? But then there's these other sites, and you've had it in the past where you watch that Walmart slab go in, or you watch that pipeline go through there, and you're just shaking your head like, that was the only way that we could have preserved this. I mean, I have a feeling this community would have really liked to know about that archaic agricultural village, or this important burial ground that we just removed all these burials. It would have been great if they still had those things but instead we now have a pipeline or another subdivision. And I guess that's the part of preservation that we don't necessarily talk about. If we're
Right,
preserving
right.
these things so that people can have pride in their heritage, and we've kind of in some ways privileged the built environment because you can still see it, but in some cases we keep the archaeological site there too and create these memorial landscapes and other things for people to remember these places. That's a drop in the bucket compared to the tens of the thousand sites that we take down each year, or that maybe don't meet the cut because of our definitions of significance or whatever, but someone would have really cared about.
Well, and I think that's a major issue with the way that we do management review. That, is there a point, like the whole kind of for me, one of the notions for like, cultural resource management, like all these review laws, cultural resources, natural resources, we have an entire review process for, the under the broader environmental umbrella, right? And that, the big question is there a point where the proponent doesn't get to do their project? And if the answer is yes, more often it's yes because they don't want to pay for it, right? It becomes too
Yeah.
expensive. And but is there a point where, like, no, I don't care how much money you're going to toss at it. This site is too important. And not all sites are going to be that important, even, eligible sites, right?
Yeah, and that happens. We all know the famous cases, right? African burial ground is an excellent example. And there's, probably been 10 African burial ground style projects. We also know the thing that went down with the Dakota Access Pipeline and how that didn't turn out the same way as the African burial ground. So we know there are sites where the community does come out in full force, and in some cases they do actually preserve the site. But I guess another part is thinking about what happens to us if a lot of the um, CRM work is done under the National Historic Preservation Act or other preservation acts. We're kind of the de facto preservationists for archaeology sites. And so, like you were saying, we try to do good enough. Nobody's perfect, right? And depending on the project and the situation, the political pressure and the financial pressure and stuff, we just try to do the best that we can. And I can understand that. But what I've noticed a lot of times among people who've been doing this for a long time is there's this defeatist mentality, and there's this idea that they're just going to destroy it anyway. Well, who cares? We're just going to record this thing and move on to the next one. I'm not saying that everybody has that, but I have noticed it, in a healthy dose throughout CRM, that people work on sites and they see them get destroyed again and again. These amazing places that they're probably the only ones that will ever be able to experience. Over the years, there's just kind of this mentality, and I don't know if that's necessarily good for CRM.
Yeah. But beyond that, I think there's also the mentality of a lot of archaeologists, particularly in CRM, they're people who like to dig up sites and find stuff, and preservation doesn't allow for that, right? Like, flag and avoid is the easiest thing, it's the cheapest thing. We can work with our clients, but really, what we want is for them to not avoid it, so we can go in there and dig it up, because that's fun. And that helps pay the bills, right? Like that, those tend to be the big ticket objects. But like that, there's the conundrum, right? Like, why are we doing that? What's in it for us? Where is, like us getting data versus us preserving that data or preserving those sites, and how do we play that out? That's not something we regularly address as CRM archaeologists.
Yeah.
Yeah, and our quest to, pay the bills, but also to have fun doing so, is done at the sake of, other people's heritage, right? Because a lot of times we don't live in those communities. We just show up with a shovel or a backhoe and do our job than get in the truck and drive back to wherever we live and sit around telling the stories of all the awesome stuff that we found. You know what I'm saying? So yeah. Is that okay? Is it? And on the other hand, too, if the one bit of joy that you get is doing what you want, which is doing archaeology, even though you know it's going to get destroyed for something that you don't necessarily agree with. I mean, it's not like we're doing work to create more park spaces in schools, or housing for people who need it. A lot of times we're building yet another subdivision, yet another lane on a highway that's already full of people, yet another thing that we don't necessarily, as far as many archaeologists who tend to be a little bit more environmentalist and left leaning, maybe sometimes the stuff that we're making way for isn't the kind of stuff that we actually like or will ever use or even agree with being created. But we've got to pay our bills, and we always wanted to do archaeology, and this is kind of the only way. So we're in the situation where we're supposed to be the ones who are preserving things, but we're motivated by our own enjoyment of doing archaeology, but also that we have to pay our bills. Is that the kind of preservation that communities need?
A little bit to riff off of Bill there is, I know, so this is the CRM podcast, and we've been mainly talking about this from, archaeology or historical preservation or buildings or whatever, heritage-based sort of views. But are people in general happy with how we do planning and construction? I think we should answer that because, we tend to silo ourselves into heritage, but I do wonder if we're having this conversation, is the environmental sector having this conversation, natural heritage, not, us. Like, there's a lot of other people affected by all this construction. And do we actually feel like there's a good process that puts communities at the heart of it? Or is it mainly we kind of do a little bit of mitigation for communities, but really it's all about whoever's building it. They're the ones who are meant to benefit the most.
Yeah, I can answer that. The answer is no. Because
I'm not happy whatsoever.
Yeah.
I'm not happy at all with any of the planning and stuff that's going on in any of the communities where I live.
Well, here's the classic problem with preservation, though, is and let's just take any archaeology site or historic building or whatever. The people who aren't happy with it are the ones that want it preserved because it's never good enough, right? It's never enough preservation to make them happy because there's not enough money, there's not enough time, whatever the case may be. It's never good enough. And the people who aren't affected by it, they're not happy. They just don't care. You know what I mean? So it's either like people don't care or they're unhappy in general, I think, about preservation and what goes on, which is a really sad state of affairs. I wish there was a better way we could handle all of this, but that's preservation in a nutshell right there too. You're only going to preserve stuff as long as somebody cares about it. The minute someone stops caring about the preservation of X thing, whether it's a prehistoric, historic building, whatever the case may be, the minute somebody dies, that was the last person that cared about that, and nobody cares, well, the next time it comes under the chopping block or the next time it comes under the bulldozer's blade, there's not going to be anybody there to stop it. And that's a simple fact of preservation right there.
Yeah, well, I don't know. We should ask Native Americans about that. They never stopped caring, and their stuff gets dug up every week.
Well, and that's the good thing about Native Americans versus, I guess, I don't know, non-Native Americans, for lack of a better word. The great thing, that's what I love about Native Americans, is because they have had a cohesive sort of, culture that they claim going back. If other cultures had that sort of cohesiveness going back, but it ends up just being a generation or two, so Native Americans have a lot more power than some people think they do. And because of the way that they think about that stuff. So I totally agree. They are holding all the cards in most cases.
Hey, surprise, surprise. I'm going to disagree with you, Chris.
Jesus.
Yeah. You knew it was coming. It's just, one, I think that's a bit of a simplification in that, like, a lot of Native Americans past is quite contentious among different groups. Like, just being in the Southwest, all the different pueblos, and there's a lot of history and who did this to who, and who claims what. There's a lot of contention about claiming whose heritage is whose. So I don't think it's quite that easy. And then, so if we were to switch that around, I'm based in Scotland. It's basically the same people for a very long time, with a little bit of intermarriage, but stuck on an island. So lots of the same people, marrying each other. It goes back, but they have the exact same issues. Like having sort of depth does not change any of the issues that what we've been discussing are the same issues that are happening over in this country, with a different history. I mean, there's a different history, but it's the same issues occurring. So I'm not sure if I agree with your statement there.
I think I meant more in general, because you're absolutely right. The more overlapping you have of Native American cultures on an area, especially ones that have been in the same place for thousands of years, they've overlapped territories, thousands of times. So I think I meant a little more broadly that, when we look at some areas, even some neighborhoods, let's say in cities, it's only a few generations back that people are like, oh yeah, this is my place. And then things could change, gentrification, whatever you want to say, things change. And it's only a few generations back. But, Native Americans in general seem to agree that, oh yeah, that's Native American. We're going to preserve that. Sure, we might be arguing about whose tribe it belongs to and when it belongs to them, but it's ours, so let us deal with it. I think I meant a little more broad sense of the term. So, well, we're about done with this topic. I know we could keep arguing about this left and right, but are there any really, really, really quick final thoughts on this in the last 30 seconds?
Yeah, I got one. And this is aimed at Bill. That, part of what caused this is that as part of a preservation for a building, Bill had done some archaeology work, and then come back to find out that, while the building's being preserved, the archaeology is not. But I'm kind of thinking about it in terms of I would like to think that, potentially the work that Bill had done contributes to the interpretation of that structure. Is that good enough? Bill work towards, helping to interpret this structure using archaeology, and maybe not all of the archaeological components are being preserved, but there is some aspect of that working towards the greater treatment of that particular property. And I don't know that has an answer, or Bill has an answer, but I thought I'd toss that out there.
No, you're definitely right. The entire campaign, the public archaeology stuff, it really actually brought this to the community's light, and it did help further a much longer campaign to save that house. They had been working for a long time, but they were mainly working from the historic preservationist aspect, and they weren't necessarily on television, and children weren't coming with their families and stuff. And so really there wasn't the community buy-in to push for this. But then after the project, there was a lot more. And so I do feel like I contributed to it. And, we do have artifacts and archaeological data that's not going to go away because it's been stored at a repository. And so, I did preserve a piece of it and everything. I guess the reason I wanted this conversation is because a lot of us are taught in school that CRM is part of historic preservation, but it's much more complicated than that. And having conversations like this are a good idea, because a lot of us do think that we're saving sites, only to find out 30 or 40 years later that, kind of we could have done something differently, or maybe we saved the sites for ourselves rather than communities. So this is maybe a kind of a reflexive discussion about something that we do every day.
All right, well, that is a great point to end this discussion on. And please leave in the comments or send us an email, wherever you want. You can find it at the show notes. And let us know what you think about this. The Twitter handles for our hosts with Twitter handles are up on the show notes as well, so you can comment there, or comment on Facebook, on the page, wherever you see it. We want to know what your definition of preservation is and how you wrestle with these topics. So thanks, and we'll see you again in 2 weeks.
That's it for another episode of the CRM Archaeology Podcast. Links to some of the items mentioned on the show are in the show notes for this podcast, which can be found at www.archpodnet.com/CRMArchPodcast. Please comment and share anywhere you see the show. If you'd like us to answer a question on a future episode, email us. Use the contact form on the website, or just email chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com. Support the show and the network at arcpodnet.com/members. Get some swag and extra content while you're there. Send us show suggestions and interview suggestions. We want this to be a resource for field technicians everywhere, and we want to know what you want to know about. Thanks to everyone for joining me this week. Thanks also to the listeners for tuning in, and we'll see you in the field. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.
Take it easy. Bye.
So, maybe, he says?
Maybe, maybe not. Goodbye, everyone.
This show is produced and recorded by the Archaeology Podcast Network, Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle, in Reno, Nevada, at the Reno Collective.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
Thanks again for listening to this episode and for supporting the Archaeology Podcast Network. If you want these shows to keep going, consider becoming a member for just $7.99 US a month. That's cheaper than a venti quad eggnog latte. Go to archpodnet.com/members for more info.